Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, September 20th, 2023. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy expresses confidence that a deal can be worked out among Republicans to pass a temporary government funding bill and prevent a shutdown when current funding expires September 30th. Just ahead, we hear from the Speaker and talk with Politico's Jennifer Haberkorn about how things are going. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says the Fed is not raising interest rates at today's meeting, but suggests one more rate hike will occur this year, and rates will be staying high for a while over concerns that inflation might not be falling fast enough. Attorney General Merrick Garland testifies before the House Judiciary Committee, saying he and the Justice Department do not take orders from the President or Congress about whom to prosecute, as he gets questions about the recent indictments of Donald Trump and Hunter Biden. President Joe Biden meets with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, promising to raise hard issues with the Prime Minister, including protecting checks and balances in a democracy, a reference to the controversial judicial reform in Israel. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky tells the United Nations Security Council that Russia's multiple vetoes of council resolutions condemning its invasion of Ukraine cannot stand, and there should be a reform that allows a vote of all the United Nations member countries to overturn those vetoes. Story from CNN, Speaker Kevin McCarthy facing a looming government shutdown deadline and intense pressure from his right flank, projected optimism that his conference can work together on potential tweaks to the conservative stopgap measure. Members from all wings of the Republican Party have been meeting in House Majority Whip Tom Emmer's office to hammer out the differences that remain in the divided conference. Here is the Speaker from this morning.
Are you any closer today to finding a deal on how to fund the government both short-term and long-term?
I feel like we are. The members are already in the meeting. I think we're making some progress. We made some progress last night. Look, it's not September 30th. The game is not over, so we continue to work through it. And I've been at this place many times before, and we're going to solve this problem.
Why do you think some of these members are looking for a top-line number, a specific number, pre-COVID levels? Are you willing to give them that? Are
these people that voted against the rule?
No, last night.
Okay, so let's walk through that rationale. Does that mean they were going to change what funding was to the DOD? No. So voting against the rule, there's no rationale for that. You're saying the bill can't come forward. This is our armed services. This is our Department of Defense. That number was never going to change. The members are down there working through the different ones, so we'll figure it out.
We'll make it a top line.
11 days out at this point, how confident are you that we will avert this government shutdown?
Look, I don't know if any of you ever played sports. Did you quit before the game was over? If you went into overtime, did you quit during that time too? I think this is where the most significant change happens. And that's why what we're going through right now, and I'm going to stay with it and solve the problem.
Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, at a news conference in the hallway of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington this morning. In answers to subsequent questions from reporters, he brought up the importance of border security, and that led to this question about whether the one-month government spending bill called the CR, continuing resolution, that has been put on the schedule for a House vote on Thursday, which has a border security bill attached, will in fact come up for a vote.
Border is a huge part of the CR. It looks like it's doomed to fail, though, tomorrow. Will you still bring it to a vote?
All right. If we're ever playing sports, I don't know if I'm going to pick you on my team. We're not going to quit. We're never going to quit.
Which is insanely popular amongst the GOP conference, and you couldn't get that passed. Are you still going to try to bring the CR, which you clearly know you have way more than 5 that are against it? Are you going to bring that to the floor?
All right. If I took that same philosophy and the basis that you asked this question, I would have quit the first time I went for the vote for Speaker. So the one thing, if you haven't learned anything about me yet, I will never quit. I think America's too great to have such small ideas. I think America's too great to quit before it's over. Look, every struggle that we've ever overcome didn't come easy. And you know what? The Democrats have spent too much money. I get it. And we want to save everything we can. We want to make sure what the Democrats have done to our border is destroying our country. Right now, the president is in New York for the UN, correct? The mayor of New York is not a Republican, correct? The closest border to New York is Canada. He could be almost the furthest away from the border. What's his number one issue?
Migrants.
Migrants. What is his biggest fiscal challenge? Migrants. Would the president even meet with him? No. Tell me one bill that has changed the border from the last administration to now. Nothing, just the administration. They have changed this border. They have made every community a border community. Again, not one of you have asked me about fentanyl. But do you know almost 300 Americans today will be poisoned and died from fentanyl? So if an airliner crashed, you would ask me about what we're doing at the FAA. Every single day in America, an airliner is crashing with poison from China coming across our border based upon the policies of this administration. So if you ever ask if I'm going to give up, no, I'm never, ever going to give up.
With more on the House Republican negotiations on government funding, we're joined by Jennifer Haberkorn, White House reporter for Politico. Thanks for being with us. Speaker Kevin McCarthy does not appear too worried that this is going to work out. What have you been hearing?
So the House Speaker likes to talk about how he's an eternal optimist, and apparently even 10 days out from a government shutdown and no clear path forward, he's maintaining that persona. So he's expressed that he sees, or that he thinks they're going to be able to figure something out. They're going to be able to keep the government funded and there won't be a shutdown. But what we have not yet heard is how that's going to happen. There's a lot of ideas floating around. There's all these conversations that my colleagues on our Congress team have reported about, among conversations among centrist Democrats, talking to McCarthy, trying to come up with a plan. But so far, nothing has emerged as something that can get 218 votes.
What are the big sticking points?
Well, all along, this has been about, the House Republicans don't want to spend as much money as basically the rest of the five parties to the spring debt agreement want to do. So one of the main things has been spending, but along the way, so many other, I don't know if we call them pet projects or other issues have come up, which has kind of muddled the water because, if you think about it, if McCarthy could just tick off all these things and include them in a single bill, he'd be able to get it done. But, there's frustration among House Republicans about the Ukraine aid. That's the $26 billion request the White House has put together to send additional funding to back the Ukrainians in their war against Russia. There's disaster funding that some people don't like. And then there's border funding, which many Republicans do like, but they want to see more of as part of this package.
A few Republicans have been able to hold this up, but many more Republicans have been speaking with reporters, venting their frustration. How is this playing out within the Republican Party?
Yeah, there's been a lot of frustration, and I've heard it. A lot of my colleagues have heard it, because we've had several shutdowns in recent history, and even Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has said, shutdowns are not good for Republicans, and so they don't want to see the government shut down. They feel like it's a political loser, and so they're voicing their frustration with these members who, are coming up with these pet projects that they want to push, and two, seem okay with the idea of the government shutting down or even supportive of the idea of the government shutting down.
We're talking with Jennifer Haberkorn with Politico. You wrote today that Speaker McCarthy is struggling to pass a bill to fund the government, and the White House isn't about to throw him a lifeline. What have they been saying?
Yeah, so we, as it became clear that House Republicans were struggling to come up with a bill to fund the government, we wanted to do some reporting on how the White House views that. And the White House's message is they came up with the deal back in the spring in the debt agreement, and every other party, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, House Democrats, and the White House want to stick to that agreement. And it's House Republicans who have walked away from the table. So they're trying to pressure McCarthy to stick to what he agreed to with President Biden back in May. And they feel like any sense of negotiation, any phone call President Biden were to make to McCarthy to say, how do we get this done, would only be negotiating against themselves and against that agreement that they signed for. So they're kind of stuck in this position right now of, the first shutdown of the Biden presidency, but there's not much that they can really do at this point to help resolve it because it is an intra-House Republican problem.
So does that mean the White House is preparing for a government shutdown?
Certainly. Certainly, the White House knows that in 10 days the government might shut down. And, from my conversations, because we've had shutdowns relatively recently, people kind of know what happens. They know, that those planning documents, have old dates on them, but they're relatively easy to update. And so no one feels like there's a ton of preparation that needs to go into that. But certainly they're cognizant of the fact that, the day a shutdown starts, that's the only story. Nothing else will get done. So even if officials are deemed essential, if you remember that's the terminology to know whether you continue to come to work or not, even if you're deemed essential, your work will become essentially and exclusively responding to the shutdown.
Jennifer Haberkorn, White House reporter for Politico. Find her stories at Politico.com and on X, formerly Twitter, at Jen Habe. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
The Republican majority on the House Budget Committee on Tuesday introduced a fiscal year 2024 budget resolution, a blueprint for spending and taxes, which they say will balance the federal budget in 10 years, reducing deficits by $16.3 trillion and resulting in a $130 billion surplus by fiscal year 2033. The Budget Committee met today to mark it up, debate it, offer amendments, and eventually vote on that plan. The ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee is Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania. He said in his opening statement that they should not be doing this, given the possibility of a federal government shutdown come October 1st.
10 days and a little under 14 hours from now, this government will shut down completely unnecessarily. Back in June, something happened that many critics thought could not happen, and that is a truly bipartisan budget agreement was reached. It raised the debt ceiling for approximately a year and a half. In addition, it set what the funding would be, both discretionary, non-defense discretionary, as well as defense, for the next year. And when I say bipartisan, sometimes, that word is thrown around and it means all of your side and one person on the other side voted for it. I don't mean that kind of bipartisanship. I mean genuine bipartisanship. 80% of House Democrats joined 67% of House Republicans to vote for that piece of legislation, myself included. There were things in that bill I did not agree with, spending priorities that I had that were not reflected in that bill. But I recognized that it was a compromise, as did 80% of my Democratic colleagues and a strong majority of my Republican colleagues. Passed the Senate by an also incredible bipartisan vote and was signed into law by the president. So why are we here? We are here because Speaker McCarthy has decided to renege on that piece of legislation that passed in June and was signed into law. And by the way, what ultimately funds the government, whether it's in the next 10 days or we have to go through a government shutdown, I will offer you this prediction. It will look largely like that piece of legislation that passed the House and passed the Senate back in June and was signed by the president. So all of this on the Republican side, seeing a rule, again, not pass on the House floor, which hadn't happened in 20 years till this year, seeing intra-party sniping on the other side, all of it is completely unnecessary. And I want people to understand, because I'm not sure everyone around here does, a government shutdown has real-life ramifications.
Congressman Brendan Boyle, ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee, he's from Pennsylvania, at today's markup of the Republican-written budget resolution, a 10-year spending and tax plan. And after 6 hours of debating it, offering amendments, the committee did vote to approve this 20-14. The Republican majority calls it the Reverse the Curse resolution, a reference to James Madison referring to federal budget deficits as a curse. Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, posting on X, formerly Twitter, that he will object to any temporary government funding bill to prevent a shutdown that also includes money for Ukraine to continue fighting off Russia's invasion. Senator Paul writing today, I'm putting congressional leadership and President Biden on notice that I will oppose any effort to hold the federal government hostage for Ukraine funding. I will not consent to expedited passage of any spending measure that provides any more U.S. aid to Ukraine. Senator Paul talked about it on the Senate floor.
They're talking about saying the only way government stays open, the only way we avoid a shutdown is by shoveling more American taxpayer dollars to Ukraine. They're going to link keeping the government open with more money to Ukraine, and I'm here to say that I'm not going to agree to it, and I will not let them shut down the government simply because they want to send more of your hard-earned tax dollars to Ukraine. Either the American people fund an endless war in Ukraine, or the uniparty threatens to shut down the government. This is a clear dereliction of duty, and I will not stand for it. Colleagues, as representatives of the American people, you should not stand for it either. The bill that comes for us should be about funding our government, not somebody else's government. I will not give consent to a bill that includes funding for Ukraine in keeping our government open.
Senator Rand Paul on the Senate floor today. The Washington Examiner has an article with this paragraph. The Biden administration requested an emergency supplemental that includes $24 billion in Ukraine aid last month, which House Republicans have rebelled against. It appears that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, had the support of the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, and other Republican Senate leaders in including Ukraine funding. But Senator Paul has become the latest lawmaker to throw a wrench in their unity, referring to the temporary government funding bill that will eventually come before the Senate. Senate today also continuing to consider separately fiscal year 2024 full-year fiscal year spending bills, and a procedural vote to allow 3 of those bills to be bundled into one, covering the Departments of Agriculture, Transportation, and Housing, failed by a vote of 49 to 48, short of the 60 needed. This is Washington Today. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell announced today that the Fed will not raise its benchmark short-term interest rate, leaving it at 5.25% to 5.5%. USA Today writes the Fed signaled another hike is likely this year amid still elevated inflation and a sturdy economy. And also Wednesday's decision to stand pat provides a reprieve to consumers who have faced steady rate increases for credit cards, adjustable rate mortgages, and other loans. Yet Americans, especially seniors, are finally seeing healthy bank savings yields after years of meager returns. Here is Fed Chair Powell at his news conference.
My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. We understand the hardship that high inflation is causing, and we remain strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Since early last year, the FOMC has significantly tightened the stance of monetary policy. We've raised our policy interest rate by 5.25 percentage points and have continued to reduce our securities holdings at a brisk pace. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening have yet to be felt. Today, we decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged and to continue to reduce our securities holdings. Looking ahead, we are in a position to proceed carefully in determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at a news conference at Federal Reserve headquarters in Washington, D.C. The Fed has raised interest rates 11 times since March 2022, and today's pause is only the second time the Fed has not raised interest rates after a meeting during that stretch. Fed Chair Powell also asked about the strength of the economy and challenges it faces.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. There are multiple external factors that are playing out right now. We see rising oil prices. We see auto workers striking. There's the looming, very real possibility of a government shutdown. And I was just wondering, for each of those things, could you talk about how you're thinking about how that might affect the course for the Fed and the economy?
So there is a long list, and you hit some of them. But it's the strike, it's government shutdown, resumption of student loan payments, higher long-term rates, oil price shock. There are a lot of things that you can look at. So what we try to do is assess all of them and handicap all of them. And ultimately, though, there's so much uncertainty around these things. I mean, to start with the strike, first of all, we absolutely don't comment on the strike, as we have no view on the strike one way or the other, but we do have to make an assessment of its economic effects to do our jobs. So, the thing about it is so uncertain. It will depend. The economic effects, it could affect, we've looked back at history, it could affect economic output, hiring, and inflation, but that's really going to depend on how broad it is and how long it's sustained for. And then it also depends on how quickly production can make up for lost production. So none of those things are known right now. It's very, very hard to know. So you just have to leave that uncertain, and we'll be learning, I think, over the course of the next intermeeting period much more about that. And the same is true for the others. I don't know if you mentioned shutdown. I think of all of these as being on the list. We don't comment on that. It hasn't traditionally had much of a macroeconomic effect. Energy prices being higher, that is a significant thing. Energy prices being up can affect spending. It can affect over time. A sustained period of higher energy prices can affect consumer expectations about inflation. We tend to look through short-term volatility and look at core inflation. But so the question is, how long are higher prices sustained? We have to take those macroeconomic effects into account as well. Those are some of them. I'm not sure if I hit them all, but ultimately, you're coming into this with an economy that appears to have significant momentum, and that's what we start with. But we do have this collection of risks that you mentioned.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Consumer inflation has dropped from a year-over-year peak of 9.1% in June 2022 to 3.7%. Wall Street today, the Dow down 76, NASDAQ down 209, S&P down 41. Fed Chair Powell talking about the auto workers' strike. A drivetrain plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which supplies the nearby Mercedes factory, went on strike today, joining the United Auto Workers plants near St. Louis, Detroit, and Toledo, Ohio, who have been striking against Ford, GM, and Stellantis. The UAW president, Shawn Fain, says that strikes against the Big Three could expand on Friday if the three companies do not increase their contract offers and come to the negotiating table. UAW has been demanding higher wages, shorter work weeks, better retirement benefits, and including electric vehicle battery factory workers in UAW contracts. And the future of electric vehicles came up today in a U.S. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee hearing with the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg. Here he is questioned by Congressman Doug LaMalfa, Republican from California.
I was found it interesting here earlier on the price of electric vehicles that an F-150 is $50,000 now because it's about $10,000 higher it should be because of supply chain and a COVID shutdown that was much longer than it should have been. So you can see an F-150 at $50,000, but you can see the Lightning version up to all electric is about $70,000 to $80,000. You can look that right up. So EV vehicles are going to be much costlier than the same equivalent, same size of a internal combustion vehicle. So that's a reality that consumers are going to face as they get pushed out of having the choices. Is what Mr. Perry was saying. Ford is losing their rear end on these things right now, and that's going to have to affect the price of everything else as well as the jobs. So the thing that it comes down to is that we're going to have to make them here, we're going to let China make them. Well, even China making them is something that people aren't asking for unless they have a free choice. So what I want to get at, Mr. Secretary, first, why are we doing all this? Is it high-speed rail? Is it because we're chasing a few tons of CO2? All these electric vehicles, is it because we're chasing CO2? Is that really the whole deal?
Here's the way I look at it. The EV revolution is happening with or without us. Exercising their free choice, Americans have tripled the proportion of cars that they are purchasing electric already, and we're still at the very outset of this revolution. You add to the fact that the cost of producing the cars will come down, and that if you've ever driven one, you probably know that it has superior performance, lower maintenance costs, lower cost of fueling it.
Not in my rural
and
district,
fewer moving
because
parts.
I have to drive many, many miles, and I can't. People don't want to come to my district so much because they can't count on being able to charge their vehicle if they want to go way up to Modoc County or something. So
Yeah, for sure. If you're driving more than a couple hundred miles a day, then you really depend on that charging infrastructure, some of which isn't there. On the other hand, the vast majority of Americans will do what Chasten and I do, which is we got a hybrid plug-in minivan. We just charge it in the garage, and it does what we need for most purposes. But anyway, the point is to get to that very important question you asked: why, if EVs are coming anyway, why have a policy intervention?
No,
Why spend taxpayer money? The answer is this:
they're being forced by government.
No, nobody's being forced.
The CEOs of these corporations don't have a spine. They're all falling in line.
I don't know if you sat down with these CEOs, but I would say they're pretty tough and smart.
No, they're scared of Washington, D.C.
Testimony from the Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg and questions from Congressman Doug LaMalfa, Republican from California, at today's House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee hearing. You can find the full hearing at our video library, cspan.org. Also, this from ABC News covering the hearing. Secretary Buttigieg said a government shutdown would come at exactly the wrong moment as the department works to address the ongoing air traffic controller shortage. While the Department of Transportation met its hiring goals this year for air traffic controllers, he noted if a government shutdown occurs at the end of the month, it would stop us in our tracks as the Federal Aviation Administration works to train new controllers. If the shutdown occurs, controllers currently working in towers would stay on the job, but training of new controllers at the FAA facility in Oklahoma would pause. That from ABC News. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. A few more headlines. The U.S. Senate getting agreement of all senators to fast-track 3 military nominations that have been held up. General Charles C.Q. Brown for Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Randy George for Army Chief of Staff, and General Eric Smith to be Commandant of the Marine Corps. Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican from Alabama, has been blocking hundreds of military nominations for months, objecting to the Pentagon's policy of giving time off and paying for travel expenses for female service members stationed in states that restrict abortion to go to other states to get that care. And a procedural vote on the Joint Chiefs of Staff chair nomination, 89-8, teeing up a final vote. And in the House, a Democratic motion to instruct its negotiators with the Senate on the fiscal year 2024 Defense Policy and Programs Bill, known as the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, to disagree with the bill's provisions prohibiting that Pentagon policy dealing with abortion, failed by a vote of 205 to 214. It was party line. Democrats voted yes, Republicans voted no. Attorney General Merrick Garland testified today before the House Judiciary Committee. This is reporting from USA Today. He struck a defiant tone in defending the Justice Department as independent of the White House and Congress, but Republicans attacked him repeatedly for the handling of high-profile investigations of Hunter Biden and Donald Trump. Merrick Garland told the Judiciary Committee, "Our job is to uphold the rule of law," in an uncharacteristically emotional statement that brought him close to tears as he described his family fleeing the Holocaust. Here is Merrick Garland.
Our job is not to take orders from the president, from Congress, or from anyone else about who or what to criminally investigate. As the president himself has said, and I reaffirm today, I am not the president's lawyer. I will add, I am not Congress's prosecutor. The Justice Department works for the American people. Our job is to follow the facts and the law, and that is what we do. All of us recognize that with this work comes public scrutiny, criticism, and legitimate oversight. These are appropriate and important given the matters and the gravity of the matters that are before the department. But singling out individual career public servants who are just doing their jobs is dangerous, particularly at a time of increased threats to the safety of public servants and their families. We will not be intimidated. We will do our jobs free from outside influence and we will not back down from defending our democracy.
Attorney General Merrick Garland, part of his opening statement at today's hearing of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. Most of the questions from the committee members were about one special counsel's investigation and indictment of Hunter Biden, President Joe Biden's son, and another special counsel's investigation and indictment of former President Donald Trump. House Republicans are starting their own investigation into whether to impeach President Biden in part because of alleged corruption involving Hunter Biden's overseas business dealings. The committee chair, Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, asked Attorney General Garland why the only charges brought against Hunter Biden so far have been tax evasion and illegal gun possession.
Here's why the statute of limitations question is important that Mr. Bishop was getting at just a few minutes ago. Here's why it's important. You let the statute of limitations lapse for 2014, 2015. Those were the years with the felony tax charges where Hunter Biden was getting income from Burisma. Here are 4 facts that I think are so important. Hunter Biden was put on the board of Burisma, made a lot of money, got paid a lot of money over those years, a couple $1 million. He wasn't qualified. Fact number 2, he wasn't qualified to be on the board of Burisma. Not my words, his words. He said he got on the board because of his last name. The brand, as Devin Archer said when he was under oath and we deposed him. Fact number 3, Burisma executives told Hunter Biden, we're under pressure, we need help. Fact number 4, Joe Biden goes to Ukraine, leverages our tax money, American people's tax money, to get the prosecutor fired who was applying the pressure. Interestingly enough, that fact is entirely consistent with what the confidential human source told the FBI, and they recorded in the 1023 form, the same form Mr. Wray didn't want to let this committee and the Congress see. That all happened. That all happened. And what I'm wondering is why you guys let the statute of limitations lapse for those tax years that dealt with Burisma income.
There's one more fact that's important, and that is that this investigation was being conducted by Mr. Weiss, an appointee of President Trump. You will, at the appropriate time, have the opportunity to ask Mr. Weiss that question, and he will no doubt address it in the public report that will be transmitted to the Congress. I don't know the answer to those questions.
Did they forget? Did the lawyers just like let it, did they just like, oh, darn, we let it, were they careless?
I expect that won't be what he says, but because I
promise... You know that's not the case, because as Mr. Bishop pointed out, they had a tolling agreement. They talked to Hunter Biden's defense counsel and say, let's extend the statute of limitations. And then at some point, they made an intentional decision to say, we're going to let the statute of limitations lapse. And I want to know who decided that and why they did it.
Mr. Weiss was a supervisor of the investigation at that time and at all times. He made the appropriate decisions, and you'll be able to ask him that question, and he will.
You know why they did it? Everyone knows why they did it. May not say it, but everyone knows why they did it. They didn't. Burisma, those tax years, that dealt with that involved the president. It's one thing to have a gun charge in Delaware. That doesn't involve the president of the United States. But Burisma, oh my, that goes right to the White House. We can't have that.
Congressman Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, chair of the Judiciary Committee, questioning the only witness at today's hearing, Attorney General Merrick Garland. Another committee member, Adam Schiff, Democrat from California, asked the Attorney General about Special Counsel Jack Smith's indictments of former President Donald Trump on charges related to the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol and the mishandling of classified documents. And he also asked about the Hunter Biden indictments.
On Sunday, the former president appeared on a national news Sunday program and was asked about 4 indictments and 91 counts facing him. His response was, Biden indictments. Excuse me, Biden political indictments. He said to the Attorney General, indict him. Mr. Attorney General, I want to give you a chance to respond. Was the president telling the truth, or was he lying when he said that President Biden told you to indict him?
No one has told me to indict, and in this case, the decision to indict was made by the special counsel.
So that statement the president made on Sunday was false?
I'm just going to say again that no one has told me who should be indicted in any matter like this, and the decision about indictment was made by Mr. Smith.
Let me ask you this question about the prosecution of Hunter Biden. The prosecutor in that case, Mr. Weiss, was appointed not by Joe Biden, but he was appointed in the first instance by Donald Trump. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And he was continued in that position, was he not?
He was continued in that position, yes.
And Mr. Attorney General, can you imagine the hue and cry you would hear from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle if you had removed him from that position? Can you imagine the claims that you had removed a prosecutor who was diligently investigating Hunter Biden? Can you imagine the outrage they would have expressed?
I can say that during my confirmation hearing, I discussed with many senators on that side of the aisle their desire and actual insistence that Mr. Weiss be continued to have responsibility for that matter. And I promised, and I said at my confirmation hearing, that he would be permitted to stay and that I would not interfere.
And Mr. Attorney General, that was exactly the right decision. That was the right decision to give the American people the confidence that even a prosecutor chosen by the former president would continue in the investigation into the son of the current president. That was exactly the right decision.
Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California, questioning the Attorney General Merrick Garland at today's Judiciary Committee hearing in Washington. From Associated Press, Ray Epps, a one-time Donald Trump supporter who was the target of a right-wing conspiracy theory about the January 6, 2021 attack that forced him into hiding, pleaded guilty on Wednesday to a misdemeanor charge for his role in the U.S. Capitol riot. He appeared remotely for a hearing in Washington's federal courthouse, entered his plea on a charge of disorderly conduct on restricted grounds a day after the case was filed in the Justice Department's massive January 6 prosecution. Ray Epps' attorney said after the hearing it was a step toward putting his client's life back together. That from AP. And this is Washington Today. Another Associated Press story in New York. President Joe Biden pledged Wednesday to raise hard issues, including protecting checks and balances in a democracy, as he sat down with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for their first meeting since Netanyahu took office at the helm of his country's far-right government late last year. The Prime Minister tried to play down concerns about his contentious proposed judicial overhaul, saying there is one thing that will never change, and that is Israel's commitment to democracy. First, President Biden.
Today, we're going to discuss some of the hard issues, and that is upholding democratic values that lie at the heart of our partnership, including checks and balances in our systems, and preserving a path to a negotiated two-state solution, and ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. Because even where we have some differences, my commitment to Israel, as you know, is ironclad. I think without Israel, there's not a Jew in the world that's secure. I think Israel is essential. And I look forward to discussing all of this with you and working together with your team to fulfill those, as Ben Gurion said, the dream of generations. I think we have a chance to, I suffer from oxymoron, Irish optimism. And I think that if you look at, if you and I 10 years ago were talking about normalization with Saudi Arabia, and I think we look at each other like, who's been drinking what? But we're
good Irish whiskey.
Good Irish whiskey. That's the reason why I've never had a drink.
President Joe Biden in New York City, sitting beside the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
I appreciate, Mr. President, your continuous commitment to prevent Iran from achieving nuclear weapons capability. I think that's critical. And that shared goal of ours can be best achieved by a credible military threat, crippling sanctions, and supporting the brave men and women of Iran who despise that regime and who are our real partners for a better future. So I look forward to working with you and your team to realize the promise and confront the threat. As I said, we live in, and you said, we live in uncertain times, rapidly changing times. So I want to reassert here before you, Mr. President, that one thing is certain and one thing will never change, and that is Israel's commitment to democracy. We will continue to uphold the values that both our proud democracies cherish. And I think that working together we'll realize the promise, roll back the dangers, and bring a better future for our region and the world. We can make history. Mr. President, with your leadership, we can make history.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in New York City meeting President Joe Biden. Again, from the Associated Press article, the location of the long-anticipated meeting, a New York hotel room on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meetings rather than the grandeur of the Oval Office, has been widely interpreted in Israel as a sign of U.S. displeasure with Prime Minister Netanyahu's new government. And the White House putting out a statement about this meeting, and it ends with this line: President Biden invited Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington, D.C. before the end of the year to continue direct collaboration on this broad range of issues. President Biden also meeting with Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. AP says they played up their mutual affection for workers' rights Wednesday as the leaders of the Western Hemisphere's two largest democracies met in New York, steering clear in public about their differences on Ukraine and other matters. They announced a new partnership on supporting labor while avoiding openly discussing disagreements such as Russia's war in Ukraine and the U.S. embargo of Cuba. Well, on Russia's war, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke at the United Nations Security Council meeting today, calling on that body to suspend Russia's veto power. Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they all have the power to veto resolutions. And Russia has used that power to kill any resolution seeking to condemn its invasion of Ukraine, not just the full-blown invasion over the last 18 months, but dating back to the 2014 invasion of eastern Ukraine. President Zelensky calling for giving the United Nations General Assembly the ability to override Security Council vetoes.
574 days of the full-fledged Russian aggression means 574 reasons for changes in this chamber. And the numbers of votes in favor of these challenges actually amounts to billions. The absolute majority of people in the world want to live in the world free of aggression. In contrast to all us, there's only a few obsessed individuals in Moscow. Veto right should not serve those who are obsessed with hatred and war. What we observe in the United Nations is an increasing support for the idea that in cases of mass atrocities against human rights, veto power should be voluntarily suspended, but we can also observe that Russia will not give up this stolen privilege voluntarily. Therefore, the UN General Assembly should be given a real power to overcome the veto. This will be the first necessary step. If it is impossible to stop the war because all efforts are vetoed by the aggressor, or those who condone the aggressor, it is necessary to bring this issue to the attention of the General Assembly. In the event of 2/3 of the votes reflecting the will of nations from Asia, Africa, Europe, both Americas, and the Pacific region, in other words, a global qualified majority, the veto should be effectively overcome, and such resolution of the General Assembly must be legally binding for all member states.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at today's United Nations Security Council meeting in New York. He also called for expanding the number of permanent members to the Security Council, which now has 5 permanent members: U.S., Russia, China, France, and Great Britain, and 10 non-permanent members elected by the General Assembly to 2-year terms. That's a reform the United States also supports. Speaking today for Russia, the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who, as he has in past speeches, blamed the U.S. and Western countries for supporting the conditions in Ukraine that led to discrimination against Russian-speaking Ukrainians and required Russian intervention. Sergei Lavrov also spoke to that issue of Russia's veto power.
The Western aggressive clique has been peddling the theme of abuse of the right of veto, and not with an incorrect focus on members of the UN. They have reached the result. This was resulted in the situation that after every exercise of the veto, the General Assembly considers the matter. This is not a problem for us at all because the Russian approaches to all issues on the agenda are open. There is no, does not pose a difficulty for us to expound on our positions or lay them out yet again. And the right to a veto is an absolutely legitimate instrument which is stipulated in the Charter of the United Nations to prevent the adoption of decisions that would divide the organization. But if the procedure for discussion of the General Assembly of applications of the veto was approved, since this was approved, then why not consider why certain resolutions without any veto that were adopted, including those many years ago, but are not being implemented, despite the provisions of Article 25 of the Charter? Why would the General Assembly not consider the reasons behind this? This includes resolutions of the Security Council of Palestine and the whole range of issues related to the Middle East, the JCPOA, Resolution 2202, which approved the Minsk agreements on Ukraine.
The interpreter for the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at today's United Nations Security Council meeting. Reports say that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did not stay at his council seat for Sergei Lavrov's speech, and likewise, Sergei Lavrov was not there when Volodymyr Zelensky spoke earlier. Thank you for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word, to get the stories making news in Washington sent to your inbox every day. It is free. You can subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.